Good evening, everybody. Reaching out tonight because tomorrow, on May 10th, the House Public Education Committee intends to consider a revision to SB 8, a school voucher bill. School vouchers are anti-civil rights legislation, and I'm enraged that some policymakers would even suggest that they could help children, let alone children with disabilities, given what we know from prior research. It is crystal clear that vouchers do not improve student outcomes. Vouchers also open the door for discrimination. I take all of this proposed voucher legislation personally, partly because I am directly aware of the struggle millions of parents went through to ensure their child could be well educated in this country. I speak with you tonight as an education researcher, but also the nephew of my Aunt Louise. My Aunt Louise was born in 1941 with cerebral palsy in Newark, New Jersey. She's denied access to public schools, and many private schools would not accept her because of her disability. The programs and support she needed to meet her potential and develop skills to live independently were not made available to her. No law in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s required that public schools or private schools admit her. So, she didn't receive equal protection under the law. Her right to a free public education was denied. Consequently, she missed out on important opportunities to develop academically, but also socially and emotionally. She was not prepared by her school to live a full life. My grandparents, from immigrant families and without a high school education, did the very best they could to educate her with the money and time they had. I would grow up with my aunt in the same house years later. As a child, I learned about her story firsthand. I understood her potential and also learned about the hardships she faced. By the time I went to public schools in the 1980s and 90s, children with cerebral palsy and other children with disabilities had the right to attend public schools with me. Had my aunt been born a few decades later, we could have gone to the same school together. My aunt's struggle is not uncommon, and hopefully it will not be forgotten. Millions of Americans have experienced the same forms of discrimination. Their struggles are rooted in the systematic denial of human rights and equal protection under the law. Her struggle and the struggle of millions of people with disabilities from all walks of life, all races, all income levels, both political parties have gone on for more than a century. But public schools made an important shift in the 1970s following multiple federal court cases. And then in 1975, Congress finally enacted a law, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act, which ensured that children with disabilities would forever have universal, free access to public education. This was a landmark civil rights bill, and I want to be clear about something. This was not just an act of Congress. This was an act of parents of children with disabilities and their allies struggling together, organizing, advocating collectively for decades. And vouchers put this historic struggle, a struggle that continues, in jeopardy. Let me be clear. The nation's special ed law, public schools, and public school districts implementing the law today, they're not perfect. We have a lot more work to do in improving public education for children with disabilities. That is exactly what we should be doing right now instead of fighting proposed anti-civil rights voucher legislation. But I also want to remind everyone what the federal special education law has done. It's provided a set of key rights that fundamentally changes the lives of millions of children and their families each day. And vouchers undermines these fundamental rights. First, the child find provision of IDEA mandates that public schools proactively identify, locate, and evaluate all children in need of special ed within their jurisdiction. Private schools have no such mandate. Second, all children with disabilities who are eligible to receive special education must be identified and provided with a free and appropriate public education. Part of receiving that free, appropriate public education is having an individualized educational program, commonly referred to as IEPs. IEPs are individualized documents that outline a child's strengths and areas of growth, goals, supports, services, placements, among other key points. And the IEP must be implemented free of charge. IEPs, though, are not mandated or even required in private schools. If a child from a public school uses a voucher in the proposed voucher legislation, that private school need not even read, never mind implement the IEP. And the private school can actually charge the parent additional money for necessary services provided for free by school districts. Third, a child with a disability attending a public school must be placed in what is called the least restrictive environment. This is a guarantee that to the maximum extent appropriate, children are included with their peers in their neighborhood school. Private schools can ignore this principle and provide any sort of placement, any sort of support, any service, or none at all. And finally, to protect the rights of parents and their child with a disability, federal law requires that public schools provide parents with a set of procedural safeguards they must follow. For example, parents can review educational records at any time. They can fully participate in all meetings and decisions related to their child's education, and they can receive prior written notice for any changes, and they must give consent for any changes. And when parents disagree with the public schools, there's a system of due process that resolves disputes based on law in a timely manner. Parents who use vouchers and send their children to private schools have no due process protections, and private schools at any time can deny admission or remove a child without parental consent. Each of these rights that I outlined, they were fought for by prior generations of parents. They were written into law by Congress. They were clarified through judicial review in federal courts over the last 50 years with the sole purpose of protecting and serving children with disabilities and stopping and rooting out the type of discrimination my Aunt Louise confronted decades ago. Yet now, today, proposed voucher bills subvert or even erase these rights. They are an open attack on the civil rights of children with disabilities and their families, and the truth is hiding in plain sight, tucked within the text of proposed voucher legislation. Please allow me to read text from a voucher bill proposed in Texas. And I quote, "A private school is not subject to federal and state laws regarding the provision of educational services to a child with a disability in the same manner as public schools." This is shocking. Vouchers, though, are not just problematic because they undermine hard-fought civil rights acquired when Congress enacted EAHCA in 1975. They harm children and have a negative impact on public schools. Bear with me. Let me give you a few examples. First, vouchers do not raise student achievement. In fact, peer-reviewed studies have found that vouchers in DC, Indiana, Louisiana, and Ohio had significant negative impact on student achievement. Even research funded by right-wing think tanks who support vouchers have come to these same conclusions. Although they don't go advertising it, and when they do their polls, they don't go sharing with parents or survey takers how they feel about knowing that vouchers persistently fail to raise student achievement. Second, vouchers subsidize wealthy families. For example, a study funded by the Walton Family Foundation, a conservative pro-voucher entity, found that in Florida, vouchers were disproportionately used by families making more than $80,000 per year. Families of children with disabilities also reported significant difficulty navigating the Florida system. In Arizona, another state with vouchers, it was primarily wealthy parents in high-performing districts using vouchers. Arizona House Minority Leader Eric Meyer said of vouchers, essentially gives the wealthy a private school discount. Third, vouchers take money out of the public school system, which in Texas would disproportionately harm small districts and rural communities. Consider Cleveland ISD in Liberty County, which enrolls 9,000 students in 11 schools with a total budget of $130 million. Nearly $100 million goes directly to staff salaries, busing, transportation, and facilities maintenance. The loss of just 1% of students would force Cleveland ISD to potentially cut 10 staff members, such as teachers or school nurses. That could wipe out an entire elementary school without any relative change in the demand for the public school to be open in that community. If you don't agree with my math, just ask the TEA deputy director, who was recorded by a parent saying vouchers will lead superintendents to make cuts. Fourth, vouchers are expensive, partly because they create a second publicly funded system that makes schooling less efficient. In that way, it's really surprising that so many conservatives support vouchers. In Arizona, their voucher program started at $2.5 million in 2011. It's now more than $350 million. As most wealthy families opt to take vouchers and move into private schools in Arizona, the cost of running public schools doesn't change. Some projections now suggest that vouchers will soon cost Arizona about $1 billion per year. And let me just remind everybody, Texas currently ranks among the bottom 10 states for equitably funding its schools, and it cannot afford to lose any more money. Relatedly, many voucher policies, including the proposed voucher legislation, they lack regulations and oversight. Many new schools will crop up if a voucher bill is passed. Those new schools will fail to recruit enough students to stay open, and they'll ultimately close, just like they've done in other states, wasting millions in taxpayer dollars and harming kids. That money could have went to supporting special education in public schools. Fifth, voucher programs that target students with disabilities are never appropriately funded to cover the actual expenses to meeting those students' unique needs. Current legislation in Texas that's proposed would provide just between $8,000 to $10,000 per student. Public school districts can spend tens of thousands of dollars or more serving students with the most intensive special education needs. For example, training teachers and paraprofessionals and then maintaining a classroom for fewer than 10 students with autism or intellectual disabilities is costly, but it's also a worthwhile endeavor that Texans agree with, that public schools establish and work to improve every day. But since private schools in a voucher scenario can pick and choose or discriminate, most will avoid picking students with disabilities, especially those with the most severe needs, even if there are vouchers. Let me put some names to the point that I'm trying to make. Journalists across the country have been telling the stories of students and families who have been discriminated against in states that have voucher schemes. In Arizona, the family of James, a 15-year-old student with autism, received a $40,000 voucher. Over a 2-year period, James was denied admission to every private school in his city. In Florida, Aiden, a 9-year-old boy with autism, ADHD, and a seizure disorder, is eligible for $11,000 per year. For more than 8 months, Aiden's mother has been unable to find a private school within driving distance to accept him. And finally, every Texan should know this, and we should not be surprised that vouchers lead to discrimination. In Texas, vouchers were first brought up in a 1956 Texas Legislative Subcommittee. The committee's report said, and I quote, "We recommended that the legislature give serious consideration to some sort of tuition grant plan or voucher whereby a parent who does not wish to place his child in an integrated school may receive state funds to have the child educated in a segregated, non-sectarian private school." Other states passed such legislation, leading to the emergence of what has become known as segregation academies in the Jim Crow South. The truth about the toxicity and failure of vouchers is clear. We should all be enraged tonight and tomorrow and the rest of this legislative session when policymakers who support vouchers, knowing the origins of how vouchers were birthed and how they have persistently failed in other states like Arizona and Florida. So to wrap up, I want to remind everybody that vouchers are anti-civil rights legislation that use taxpayer money to discriminate against children with disabilities. School vouchers undermine decades of parent advocacy for children with disabilities, and researchers consistently find that students using vouchers have a significant decline in their achievement over time. Vouchers, this proposed voucher legislation, it's in the way of focusing on improving our public education system and taking the steps and making the investments we need to improve the lives of children in our state. So I'm asking you all tomorrow to please fight against vouchers and for our public schools, not out of ideology, not out of party affiliation, but because the evidence suggests that this is the most efficient, effective, and appropriate way to improve the lives of Texas children. Public schools are part of our communities. Private schools are not. And so I'm asking you again to fight against vouchers, this anti-civil rights legislation. Thank you.